Good morning. My intention today is to kind of wrap up the story of the life of King David in the final chapters of Second Samuel. However, I want to start by revisiting the words which God gave for David and the other kings who would follow him, all the way back in the Law of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me. And you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver or gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandments, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. When I read this, I'm reminded that David was perhaps the best of the kings following these commandments. He loved the law of God, he spoke of it regularly in his Psalms, and yet David also showed great failures of keeping it. David did acquire many wives for himself, and he transgressed the laws in many ways at different times. And unfortunately, the last part of Second Samuel, the section that we're going to read today, is mostly about David's failures as a king, as a father, and as a man. Most of these stories we won't revisit, especially the ones about David's dealings with his family. In the past year, I've preached on that subject quite a bit, and so I won't revisit it today. But suffice it to say that as David ages, he shows a lot of great failures and weaknesses and insufficiencies. Although through all of it, I think the desires of his heart do shine through, and that's where the spirit of guilt comes from. Many of the successes of his youth echo in different ways into his later life. However, unfortunately, many times they show David to be failing as he begins to realize he's not really enough to bring about all of God's purposes as he had once hoped. One of the endearing things that we do see in this later part of David's life is we can really see David be aware of his legacy and try to prepare to leave his people in a better place than they were when he first reigned. 2 Samuel chapter 21 in particular is kind of a chapter of loose ends. In the beginning part of this chapter, David turns his heart to atonement for his people. Although the nation has come a long way and serves God better than they had in the past, there are still sins to atone for. In the beginning of this chapter, David pays particular attention to the Gibeonites, a people whom King Saul had massacred before him, and whom the chapter reveals Israel still bore guilt for. David wants to make things right so that the nation can prosper after him, after he has passed away and left his reign to another. And so um, David understands that something has to be done to make atonement for Saul's sin against the Gibeonites. God's decree after the flood requires that when a man's blood is shed, he will require blood of man in return. And so, seven sons of Saul are executed to make atonement for the sins of Saul's family against the innocents. This is one story among many where we see this continuing theme of the idea of blood atonements. As harsh as it is, there is a requirement in the law of Moses and in the law of God that it is only blood that can make the sins of the past right. In verse 15, there's another loose end that we come to. There is war with the Philistines once again. David is, of course, the great warrior king who has attained fame first and foremost because he slew Goliath and rescued his people. And now, at this time, in his elderly age, he is courageous enough to do what few kings would be willing to do. And he goes to battle once again personally and personally duels with Ishbi Benob, one of the last remaining giants and the kin of Goliath. But this time is not as before. And David does not have the strength to withstand the battle. He can't prevail against the giant as he once did against Goliath. And so Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, the chief of David's personal mighty men, intervenes, and he is the one who kills the giant. They decide at that time that David no longer should go out to battle at risk of Israel losing their king. David's age, his limitations, and even his personal failures are really the theme of these last chapters. And it's a section of the Bible that really makes me sad. I've struggled with how to read it, how to find encouragement from it, but I find it undeniable that these stories are presented in such a way to make us realize that although David was great, although he was a man after God's own heart, he was not sufficient to do all the Lord's will. The purposes of God were left incomplete, and there was still more that had to come. And that's the tone that we're really left with as we get to the very last chapter of 2 Samuel, chapter 24, which is where I want to spend most of our time today. And I'll read this chapter in its entirety before discussing it. 2 Samuel 24, starting in verse 1. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go, number Israel and Judah. So the king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, Go through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know the number of them. But Joab said to the king, May the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my lord the king still see it. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing? But the king's word prevailed against Joab and the commanders of the army. So Joab and the commanders of the army went out from the presence of the king to number the people of Israel. They crossed the Jordan and began from Aroer and from the city that is in the middle of the valley towards Gad and on to Jazer. They then came to Gilead and to Kadesh, the land of the Hittites, and they came to Dan, and from Dan they went around to Sidon, and came to the fortress of Tyre and to all the cities of the Hivites and the Canaanites. And they went out to the Negev of Judah at Beersheba. So when they had gone through all the lands, they came to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. And Joab gave the sum of the numbering of the people to the king. In Israel there were 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000. But David's heart struck him after he had numbered the people. And David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. And when David arose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and say to David, Thus says the Lord, 3 things I offer you. Choose one of them, that I may do it to you. So Gad came to David and told him and said to him, Shall 3 years of famine come to you in your lands? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days' pestilence in your lands? Now consider and decide what answer I shall return to him who sent me. Then David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall into the hand of man. So the Lord sent a pestilence on Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and there died of the people from Dan to Beersheba 70,000 men. And when the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who was working destruction among the people, It is enough. Now stay your hands. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Then David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking the people and said, Behold, I have sinned and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house. And Gad came that day to David and said to him, Go up, raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went up at Gad's word, as the Lord commanded. And when Araunah had looked down, he saw the king and his servants coming on toward him. And Araunah went out and paid homage to the king with his face toward the ground. Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servants?" David said, "To buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be averted from the people." Then Araunah said to David, "Let the lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. All this, O king, Araunah gives to the king." And Araunah said to the king, "May the Lord your God accept you." But the king said to Araunah, "No, but I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God. That costs me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord responded to the plea for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. This final story in 2 Samuel is a story that has always troubled me and saddened me. The way I've heard it explained goes something like this: God was angry with Israel, and as part of that anger, he incites David to sin as well. David is wrong to take the census because doing so expresses a certain amount of pride and possessiveness over the people. David is behaving as if the people belong to him and they are his to count. And it is specifically this pride and possessiveness that makes God even more angry with David, and so God punishes him. Uh, However, I've come to think that there's some issues with this viewpoint, and I've come to consider a different viewpoint that I had not been aware of until recently. Um, Here are some of the problems I have with the perspective that I presented to you. Firstly, why would God incite David to sin? Doesn't James 1 verse 13 say that God tempts no one with sin? Rather, sin comes from a person's own desires. And additionally, isn't it unfair that God would stir up David to strike against his own people to do something wrong and then punish him for it? The second issue is that I don't see any way that it's a sin to take a census. And that's not based on my opinion about whether a census is right or wrong. It's based on the fact that the law of Moses appoints censuses. The law of Moses itself says it's right for a king to take a census and instructs how to do it. How can it be a sin itself for David to take a census here in 2 Samuel 24? And thirdly, I feel like this explanation as a whole doesn't help us understand the specificity, the specificity and the plurality of options that David gets David. And that's not necessarily a problem, but it is something worth thinking about. Is there a reason for God giving David those options? Why specifically as well? Do the people suffer from a plague after the census and not some other type of punishments? It does feel like there has to be some sort of reason and explanation here. But there is something else going on here. And it goes back to that passage we read at the beginning in Deuteronomy chapter 17. The idea that the king must know the law of Moses inside and out. He must write a copy for himself with his own hand and study it day by day. He has to do this because he is responsible for leading the people. He has special responsibility to instruct the people in the way that they should go and protect his people from disobeying it in ignorance. And if we want to know what's really going on here, we have to do the same. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 30, where I think we will get a little bit of clarity on the situation. This is the section where God gives specific instructions on how a census is to be conducted in the land of Israel. We'll start in verse 11 of Exodus chapter 30. The Lord said to Moses, "When you take the census of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom for his life to the Lord when you number him, that there be no plague among them when you number them. Each one who is numbered in the census shall give this, half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs, half a shekel as an offering to the Lord. This is not an insignificant sum, by the way. Remember that David only paid 50 shekels for the threshing floor and the oxen. Everyone who is numbered in the census from 20 years old and upward shall give the Lord's offering. The rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less than half the shekel. When you give the Lord's offering to make atonement for your lives, you shall take the atonement money from the people of Israel and shall give it for the service of the tent of meeting, that it may bring the people of Israel to remembrance before the Lord, so as to make atonement for your lives. There is something special going on in this chapter. To us, when we think of a census, we think of taking a census for filling the Wikipedia page and calculating the GDP of our country. That is not what is going on here. In Exodus chapter 30, a census is supposed to be something more than that. There's an idea of atonement. It's taking a parallel role to even the sacrifices at the temple. Exodus 30:12 says that the half shekel tax is actually a ransom for a person's life before the Lord. And verse 16 says that it makes an atonement to God. And this passage, I think, makes the 2 Samuel 24 story start to make a little more sense. Because from the very outset, 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, makes clear that initially it was Israel God was angry with, not David. And taken in conjunction with the purpose of a census that we read in Exodus 30, it seems as if this census is actually intended to make reconciliation between the people and God, to offer a ransom and make atonement for the people. Of course, there is an issue in the first verse of 2 Samuel 24, and it's when it says that God incited David against Israel. Uh, that's the key phrase, which has always made me think that David's sin was in taking the census in and of itself. But I was surprised when I looked up this phrase in an interlinear. In English, that sounds like a negative thing. It sounds like David was incited in anger and opposition. It sounds like David is sinning. But that phrase in Hebrew I found is not necessarily negative. For example, the same phrase is used in Job 36:16, and God uses it of himself when he says that he's going to take Job's distress away from him. It means to initiate something, to instigate something, not necessarily to act in opposition or anger. Now, I'm always nervous to challenge the translators on these sorts of things. They're a lot smarter than me. They have a lot of checks and balances in place to not make translation errors. And this isn't a translation error, it is a correct meaning of the word. But I think that it gives the wrong impression for what's going on. I think, based on Deuteronomy 30, based on James 1:13, and everything else that follows in this story, that David is not sinning by taking the census, and that the verse says that God is instigating David to start this. And at least that part of it is actually a good thing. You be the judge yourself and see if that makes sense with the story that follows. So David takes the census. Why he is doing this, how God stirs him up, is not made absolutely clear. The parallel passage in Chronicles might help a little bit. It says that David is stirred up by an adversary, al Satan in the Hebrew. This could indicate Satan as in the angel, or it could actually indicate a human adversary, which seems more likely. It would make sense if David is taking a census in haste because he expects a foreign military adversary to stir up war against him. But regardless, if taking the census in and of itself is not the sin that invites new punishments, what is the sin that David commits? Well, it seems like it's probably actually a sin of omission, because nowhere in 2 Samuel 24 do we see David do what was commanded in Deuteronomy 30, to take the half shekel tax from the people for the operation of God's worship that is required at this time. Now it seems like we might be getting somewhere with understanding the story. We don't have to speculate whether taking the census was a sin or not, because we know that not taking the half shekel tax was a sin. And this seems to be why David is in error. And Exodus 30:12 is even very specific about what will happen if that tax is not taken. Exodus 30 verse 12 says this: When you take a census of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom for his life to the Lord when you number them, so that there will be no plague among them when you number them. If atonement is not made, then the result is very specific. There will be a plague among the people. And what happens in 2 Samuel 24? Surprise, there's a plague. God isn't being vindictive here. He's the one who actually initiated David to try to make the atonement for the people's error, and David fails to make that atonement. And so what happens is simply the predictable result that Deuteronomy chapter 30 said would happen. And I think that the facts that this passage is so difficult to interpret and is a passage that has confused me all my life really is a harsh lesson, because my failure in misunderstanding it mirrors David's failure. David, as king, was commanded to keep a copy of that law and to know it by heart. And in this story, David simply fails to keep that law, either out of negligence or ignorance. We just don't know. And of course, I've been able to understand the story. I've failed to understand the story for the same exact reasons. I've simply neglected to understand the Old Testament and what it actually says about the census. 2 Samuel is written in such a way that it presupposes a knowledge of God's law. It only makes sense when you have all the pieces of the Old Testament together to understand what's really going on. And yet there is still more to the story. Because when David fails to make that proper atonement, when he fails to take the half shekel tax and make a ransom for the people, God gives him another option. In fact, he gives David three options: accept 3 years of famine, and the common people will bear the brunt for their sin; be exiled for 3 months while your enemies pursue you, just as Saul had pursued him in the past; or accept 3 days of plague, which is the natural consequence of the failing to keep Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, the final one here is the natural one. It's the one that should happen according to the law, and indeed it does. But this is my interpretation. I suspect that what is going on here is God is offering David a choice to take the punishments upon himself. Yes, David has done wrong in not following Deuteronomy chapter 30 and taking the tax. But ultimately, this situation as a whole, from the very beginning in verse 1, was about God being angry at Israel for their sin, not necessarily David's. If David does accept the 3 months in exile, perhaps it is atonement for his own sin, and David certainly sees it that way from his words. But it's also presented as an alternative to the punishment for the people which Deuteronomy 30 requires. If David goes into exile for 3 months, the people will not have a plague. God is offering David the opportunity to intercede for the people and put himself in harm's way so that the people can be spared. God's offering David a chance to be a substitutionary atonement, where the people are spared even though they're the ones who deserve the consequence, and David takes the consequence in their place. But David is just not up for the task. He says, "Let us fall into the hands of God, but I cannot bear to fall into the hands of another man once again." And so God does this. He doesn't punish David. He simply sends the plague that Deuteronomy chapter 30 said would happen. 70,000 of the people perish, and David is full immediately of regret. He acknowledges that he, David, is supposed to be the shepherd of his people. He believes now that as king, he should have protected them and atoned for them. And this regret motivates the final part of the story. Now, it's worth noting that the story's place in 2 Samuel is apparently not chronological. The Parallel Chronicles passage says that the tabernacle was still in Gideon, so this must have happened earlier in David's reign. Regardless, David now purchases a threshing floor from a Jebusite, one of the remainders of the native population who occupied Jerusalem before David. The Jebusite offers the threshing floor freely to David, but David says, "I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." And David offers sacrifices to God here. to make atonement for his own failures and for the failures of his people. I assume that David offered sacrifices through a Levite, although the text doesn't specify. This threshing floor is important too, because according to 2 Chronicles 3:1, this is the very site where later, just a generation later, Solomon will build the permanent temple. It's a lasting legacy of David's desire to atone. And yet, David's own atonement was really a failure. He failed to keep the law, he failed to provide reconciliation for his people's sin, and when God offered him a chance to be a substitutionary atonement himself, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. It's deliberate that this story, especially since we know it's not chronological, is the last one presented to us in 2 Samuel 24. In a sense, it sums up David's life. It's deliberate that it's last. David is the man who desired to bring his people close to God and reconcile them forever. He does this in bringing the ark to Jerusalem. He does it in appointing psalmists and preparing new worship for the people to participate in. He does it in preparing for Solomon to build the temple. And he does it now in buying the threshing floor and providing the location for that future temple. David wants desperately to make the people right with God, but ultimately he fails. He just can't do it. He's not strong enough to be the sacrifice, and so 70,000 people here in this story die for their sins. David's intentions are noble, but he is just not strong enough. And the threshing floor here carries important symbolic weights. A threshing floor is the place where you harvest wheat or oats and separate the grain from the stalk by brutal physical means. You can do it by beating on it with flails, or you can do it by trampling on it with livestock. And I know I'm presenting the sad side of the story here. That's what this section of the book is. But that's a lot of what David's life is. It's tragic and it's brutal. But David's life and his desire for true worship is the threshing floor, which later yields fruit. The Jewish temple, and eventually the universal Messiah. David himself ultimately was not enough. That's the message. No man is. He was not able to himself be that substitutionary atonement that made people right with God and protected them from judgment. But God does use David as an initiator to start the plan for these things rolling, and as a prophet to pave the way for the man who eventually could do those things. And I think that's why it's the last story in the book. It's pointing us not towards David, not as an idol, not as a man who we wish we could be like and fulfilled all of humankind's desires. It was pointing towards the only person who can, Jesus Christ. There was nobody before and nobody after who could ultimately be up to the task of the things that God wanted David to do. In 1 Kings chapter 2, 1 through 4, David is on his deathbed, and it's actually a beautiful scene because he's given a rare blessing for a warlord of his day, and our day too, for that matter. He's allowed to die in peace, and he passes on his legacy peacefully to his son Solomon, and he says this: I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their hearts and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. A complete knowledge of the biblical story gives a lot of weight to David's words here. This is a story that runs as a thread through every book of Scripture, and David has at least some awareness of what it means. Solomon's charge is not just to preserve David's earthly dynasty. God has promised that if David's descendants are faithful, they shall always retain the throne of Israel. And of course, just like David, these men eventually fail. At one point, God finally takes the kingdom from them, and Zedekiah becomes the last Davidic king. to reign physically on the throne of Israel. And yet, although David's line has failed to keep the covenants, it is still God's desire to do everything that he said he would do and fulfill David's legacy. And eventually, a new son of David does come, and that son is Jesus Christ. It's the story of the New Testament as a whole, not the Old Testament, which ultimately fulfills David's life and his calling. And Jesus is the one who becomes strong enough to do everything that David could not. He becomes the one to make substitutionary atonement for the people, to bear the penalty of sin in order to protect people from judgment. Jesus is the one who also completes David's desire for pure worship and invites all the world to come in and worship him in spirit and in truth. And of course, that's why we're here today. We don't have to fear plague from God anymore. We're not dependent on an imperfect king to try to make the right decisions for us. We are not left without an intercessor. Most importantly, we don't have to fear judgments after life. Jesus has done everything for us already that David could not. We can trust in his full atonement and protection. And although the story of 2 Samuel still makes me sad, it leaves me with hope as well, knowing that all those griefs, like the threshing floor, prepared the way for the story of peace that we get to enjoy instead. That message is yours today as we stand and sing.